Matthew chapter 12, beginning verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He went on from there and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Which of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord. When I was maybe 4 years old, I set my hand on a hot skillet and got burned. It's the kind of thing that 4-year-olds do. I set my hand on a hot skillet and got burned. It wasn't that bad, but it hurt, and I remembered it. And so I came up with a simple expedient, simple rule: don't go in the kitchen. On the theory that if I didn't go in the kitchen, I wouldn't encounter a hot skillet. If I didn't encounter a hot skillet, I wouldn't get burned. If I thought this through a little further, I should have just kept out of the house altogether. Right? That was not a sustainable solution in the long run, but this is, in its own small way, a version of what the Pharisees did with God's law. I want to put a good word in here for the Pharisees. You don't hear that very often. But I want to put a good word in here for the Pharisees. They come off as the villains of the New Testament, and not without reason. They were fairly constantly plotting to destroy Jesus. But their intention, believe it or not, their intention was good. Their intention was good. The Pharisees wanted to keep God's commandments. That was their objective. They wanted not only to keep the law themselves, but they wanted to encourage and to teach others to keep the law of God. They wanted Israel to be holy, which, is exactly what Israel was commanded to be. They wanted Israel to be holy. Every single Jew, man, woman, and child, to keep the law. Good and noble desire. A good and noble desire. The problem was that humanity has the same relationship with the commandments of the Lord that it does with the giant sign next to the electrical substation that says, "Do not touch." We see the rule, we see the commandment, and what do you want to do? You want to stick your hand in there and die. Don't know why. But if there's a sign that says keep out, we want to go in. Whatever's prohibited is what we want to do. So the Pharisees were one of the two major classifications, denominations, whatever you want to call it, of Judaism in Jesus' day. The Pharisees came up with a plan. Basically, it consisted in building a fence around the law. A metaphorical fence around the law. For example, I'll give you an example. The second commandment, right? The second commandment forbids making and worshiping idols, right? Graven images. So what the Pharisees said is, hey, you know what? If we don't depict in artistic form any man or beast whatsoever under any circumstances, then we will not have created any idols. We won't even have gotten close to it. And everything will be fine. So that's what they did. They forbade not just making idols, but they forbade basically most decorative art, anything that had pictures of men or animals in it. Consequently, ancient Jewish art took the form of the same form that a lot of Irish art did, and a lot of geometric patterns and that kind of thing, right? The idea being, again, that if you never made an image, you could be reasonably certain that you would not have made an idol to a pagan god. The other commandments followed sort of the same pattern, right? So it's forbidden. We talked about this on Wednesday in Bible study. It's forbidden in the third commandment to take the name of the Lord in vain. Fair enough. Well, the Pharisees reasoned, if you never say the name of the Lord, you won't take it in vain. So anywhere the name of God occurred in the Scriptures, even in the synagogue, even when they were reading in the synagogue, anywhere that the name of God, and by the name of God, I mean that the four-letter name that, to be honest, we don't know how to pronounce properly because no one said it for about 3,000 years. But YHWH. It probably originally was pronounced something like Yahweh. But their reasoning was that if you never actually spoke it, you couldn't misspeak it. And so anytime they came across the name of the Lord, they replaced it with the word Adonai, which means Lord. Likewise, oh, by the way, yeah, we also mentioned this on Wednesday. Medieval Christian scholars misread the Hebrew manuscripts. They misread the old Jews. In order to make sure that they said Adonai instead of Yahweh, they added the vowels of Adonai to the consonants of Yahweh. And that was just a kind of a shorthand reminder to say the one instead of the other. Medieval Christian scholars read it all together, came up with the word Jehovah, which never actually existed. So I know I've just ruined Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for you. I apologize. You can hate me later. You can hate me now. I don't even care. Seventh commandment. Seventh commandment forbade adultery, right? You shall not commit adultery. So the Pharisees, in a perfectly commendable attempt to avoid even the hint of adultery, forbade the sight of women's hair on the theory that women's hair is particularly attractive. I guess it depends on the woman. I don't know. But they forbade it. To this day, if you run into an observant Orthodox Jewish woman, she's probably wearing a wig. They tend to wear very nice wigs, so you wouldn't necessarily, know. But if you pay attention, she's probably wearing a wig. The idea being that the only person who should ever see her hair is her husband. Some of the more obscure commandments raised particular problems. Exodus 23, verse 19, forbids boiling a kid, that is, a young goat, in its mother's milk. That's what it says. Now, this pretty clearly, in context, referred to a Canaanite pagan religious ritual that was forbidden to the Israelites. But 1,500 years later, it was as mystifying to the Pharisees as it is to us. So they just did the best they could with it, and they forbid people to eat meat and dairy together. So this is why cheeseburgers are not kosher. The fourth commandment was an area of particular concern for the Pharisees, and for good reason. It established the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, as a day of rest and worship for the people of God, on which they were forbidden to do work, but were commanded to worship and to rest. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. It's Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Again, the Pharisees' main concern was the holiness of Israel, her obedience to the commandments of the Lord, and their strategy was to fence in the commandments so that no one would come close to violating them, so they made rules. And in terms of the Sabbath, they made dozens of rules about what exactly you could and you couldn't do on the Sabbath. Like, for example, how far you can walk. These rules still exist in Rabbinic Judaism today. If you drive to Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh and you drive around, you will see colored tape on telephone poles. I don't know if you've ever noticed it. There's colored tape on the telephone poles. That colored tape tells you how far you can walk on the Sabbath, depending on where you live exactly. There is a reason why Orthodox Jews live in the immediate neighborhood around their synagogue, because it's forbidden to take a journey beyond a certain distance on the Sabbath. So they have to live within a certain distance of the synagogue in order to attend services. These rules still exist. There were other rules about what consists in lighting a fire was forbidden. To this day, lighting a fire, the reasoning was that a spark is a form of fire, and when you turn on a switch, you're creating a spark, therefore lighting a fire. When you open your refrigerator, a light comes on, and you are making a fire, forbidden on the Sabbath. And so people install switches on their refrigerators in order to, they turn the switch, and that disables the internal switch that makes the light come on when you open the door, so that on the Sabbath you flip the switch, and then when you open and close your refrigerator, the light doesn't come on. These are all the rules that were built around the Sabbath, right? They lay at the heart of the accusation against Jesus here in Matthew 12. Matthew tells us that Jesus and his disciples were walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. Apparently, at least a couple of the disciples were hungry. And so they did the kind of thing that you do when you're hungry. They just kind of idly picked a couple heads of grain, started chewing on it. Not exactly a meal, right? But some Pharisees saw, and they were indignant. Plucking grain, they argued, is a form of harvesting. Harvesting is work, and therefore forbidden on the Sabbath. Didn't Jesus know this? His reply, it's interesting here because his reply isn't exactly direct. It's more of a history lesson, right? He says, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." You see, this is where the Pharisees went wrong, right? In their zeal. And in its twisted way, it was a righteous zeal. In their zeal, they forgot the law's original purpose. They forgot why God gave his people the law in the first place. The law had been given, and I'm not making this up. These are 3 categories that I stole from John Calvin. But anyway, the law was given for 3 purposes. The first purpose of the law was to order society. Just set the basic rules for everybody to get along. So, for example, you shall not murder. That's a good law to have. If you don't have that law, your society is going to be a horrible, horrible place to live. Right? So the first use of the law is ordering society. The second use of the law is to show us our sinfulness and our need for a Savior. So the law was given as a gift to show us what holiness is, what God requires, and kind of as an oh, by the way, to show us where we fail. And in showing us that we have failed, the law drives us to Christ because we recognize our guilt, our inability to save ourselves. The law shows us that. The law shows us our need for forgiveness and for the grace of God in Jesus Christ. That's the second use of the law. The third use of the law is that in showing us what holiness is, the law guides us. Having been forgiven, how do we live, right? What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? Well, the law gives us a picture of that. The law was a gift. It was a gift from God to us. It was a blessing or intended to be so. And the Pharisees, well-meaning as they were, they had made it into a curse. They had made it into a prison. They had made it into a prison that boxed people in or kept people out, depending on how you look at it. Into something that condemned hungry men for plucking a few ears of grain on the wrong day, to something that condemned a man for healing another human being on the Sabbath, this man with the withered hand, right? That's what all of these examples that Jesus gave have in common. Why did David take the bread from the temple? Why did he take the bread of the presence when Saul was chasing him and trying to kill him? He took it because his men were starving. And the law of God was not intended to starve men, especially a man who had been anointed as Israel's rightful king. Why is it that the priests in the temple can work on the Sabbath and not profane it? Because they are serving God. Why is it that you can heal a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath? Because it's a work of mercy and service to God. Jesus' point was to bring the law back into focus. It wasn't given to oppress people. It was given as a guide. It wasn't meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a guardrail. Both prisons and guardrails are made out of the same stuff. It's all steel. A lot of it involves bars. But we recognize that they serve very different purposes, right? A prison is built to keep people in, and a guardrail is built to make sure you don't go over the cliff. You ever watch those? There was a show on TV a few years ago, World's Most Dangerous Roads. Did you ever watch that? These roads in South America that are like built into the side of a cliff, and they're about 6 feet wide, and there's some guy trying to pass a bus on a motorcycle, and a 3,000-foot sheer drop to the left. Those people need guardrails. So if you ever want to do a great service to the world, go to Bolivia and build some guardrails. You will save lives. Guardrails and prisons are both made out of the same stuff, but they serve very different purposes. One is to punish, to condemn, and the other is to protect and preserve. God did not give his law to be a prison. He gave his law to be a guardrail. To steer the errant constantly toward the narrow path that leads to life. By adding layers of unbiblical prohibitions, the Pharisees had been laying a burden on the people that the law of the Lord didn't. Jesus wasn't denying the law, far from it. He said he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He was simply pointing people to its original purpose. There's an irony here for us. There's an irony here for us because we can look at this and say, aha, silly Pharisees with all their rules. Silly people didn't understand. And we can say, we don't need those rules. Here's the irony. Adding to the law the way the Pharisees did creates a stumbling block. It oppresses people, but so does taking the law away entirely. Prisons may not be a good thing, but guardrails are absolutely necessary. Without them, people veer off the path and suffer. By neglect of the law, just as surely as the Pharisees, we place burdens on people. Give you an example. There was a company in England, this was in the news last week. There was a company in England that offered its employees unlimited vacation. And I don't know how that was supposed to work. Basically, here was the rule. You could take any time you want off, anytime, ever, for any reason. Good luck. They kept this up for 2 years. Guess what happened? They had to do away with it. Do you know why? Nobody took vacation. It's exactly the opposite of what you expect. Nobody took vacation. People were taking half the vacation time that they had back when they had 2 weeks. What was supposed to be a gift to the workers ended up causing them to work harder for the same money. They said that they interviewed people, and people said, first of all, that they felt guilty about taking any vacation at that point. They also said that in the old days, when they had their 2 weeks, that was going to, at the end of the, a lot of places, at the end of the year, your 2 weeks goes away. I don't know how your vacation works, but if you don't use it that year, you lose it. So what would happen is people would look at their calendar and say, oh, I've got 5 days of vacation left. I really need to use this sometime. And they would go ahead and schedule time off. When they had unlimited vacation, they looked at their calendar and said, I can take any time off I want. I'm not taking any time off. That's a petty example, but that shows you how it works. When you take the law away, it doesn't liberate people. It leaves them rudderless. It leaves them rudderless. Modern America, and this is where it hurts for us. Because guess what? You and I, folks, we live in the worst of both worlds. Those old Pharisees, they were scolds. The pagans, the ancient pagans, were libertines. Right? The scolds were always yelling at people for doing things they shouldn't do. The libertines were saying, hey, do anything you want. You and I, we are the first society in the history of the world to be a society of libertine scolds. We are. Because we simultaneously tell people, hey, do whatever you want, and then come down on them like a ton of bricks for stuff that isn't, strictly speaking, immoral. Or at least is just a matter of taste. You don't believe me? Go home and let your kids play unsupervised in the backyard with Confederate flags. And tell me how long it is until you show up on Channel 4 News. Seriously. Don't ever let your kids go to the park by themselves. You get arrested. It's ridiculous, but hey, that's the world in which we live, right? God help you if they're carrying a model of the General Lee and, I don't know, something else. Pick something offensive, right? These are things, it's funny because we tell people, hey, you know what? The really big stuff doesn't matter. Do whatever you want. But the really little stuff, we come down on people so hard. And we're so judgmental. It's unbelievable how cruel people are about things that don't matter. We are the first ever living society of libertine scolds, and that's not a good thing. It happens in the church too, or at least it's always a temptation in the church. The temptation for the church is, on the one hand, to disregard God's commandments. just to disregard them. And say, you know what? I know that the Lord commanded us not to neglect meeting together. I know that He commands us to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. But man, it's really nice out today. I'm not going, I'm not going somewhere. And we say, well, okay. But God help you if you try to change the color of the carpet. I could stand here and I could spout heresy. I could stand here and tell you any kind of untruth. I could tell you a whole lot of nonsense. I could add a fourth person to the Trinity. And you know what? Most of you would blink at me. All right. But if I repainted the sanctuary a bad color, you'd fire me. I'm not painting the sanctuary, by the way. Somebody else can do that. This is always a temptation. The temptation to discard the law on the one hand and say, you know what, this gift that God has given us as a guardrail, this gift that God has given us as a guide to obedience, we don't need it. And at the same time, to start making things up on our own and coming down on each other like a ton of bricks. The law was not meant as punishment. The law was not meant as a curse. The law was a gift of God, is a gift of God. For the ordering of society, to show us our sin, yes. To convict us, to drive us to Jesus, but also to show us how to live. If we start adding to it and making rules up that don't matter, we're just laying a burden on people. But if we throw it away, we're also laying a burden on people. Jesus, the Son of Man, is Lord not only of the Sabbath, but Lord of the law. It's a gift to us to turn us to Him. Let's be careful how we use it. Amen.